Well, we all know that the Old Testament is part of our Christian Bibles. And we all know that we ought to read it. And we all know that Jesus said of these Old Testament scriptures, they testify of me, John 5:39. But sometimes we have a challenge figuring out how we relate to the Old Testament, which doesn't quite as directly address us as does the New. And for example, are we to see something of the performance of our music ministry team in the twisting off of a dove's head in sacrifice? Not sure how that directly relates. Depends who's involved with the singing, I suppose. Does the temple represent an architectural plan by which we ought to build our church building? Makes me think of some of the games that we play. Have you ever played a game of either tabletop hockey or foosball? Probably everybody's at least seen them, right? For years, I attended the Okanagan Hockey School in Penticton, BC, and when we were there in our off times, we had a lounge that was just filled with foosball tables, and we would play vicious tournaments. When we went to college, again, this was a major activity in the student union building. It was a critical sport, really. And we would play for hours. And one of my roommates in my senior year got us our own foosball table for our apartment. I also had a great table hockey set growing up with little players with little jerseys on them. I had Luc Robitaille, very exciting. And these games are a lot of fun. And part of the fun is their relationship to the real game of ice hockey and the real game of soccer. You and I most likely would never confuse the tabletop game with the real thing. But if you put your imagination cap on for a minute and try to think about what it would be like for a family somewhere who was given a table hockey game, who had never seen a game of hockey, but not only that, had no idea that such a thing existed. They wouldn't know that it was a copy of the real thing, and they wouldn't know that it was from the real thing that it gained most of its meaning and most of its appeal. It wouldn't remind them of the true and grown-up game. And as the book of Hebrews points out, this is more or less the circumstance for the people living under the old or previous covenant to whom the Old Testament scriptures were written. They were playing the tabletop game of faith. But so that we don't get too arrogant and think we're really putting on our skates and getting on the ice, the contrast is not between the tabletop Old Testament and the skates in the New Testament, but rather between the tabletop Old Testament and the heavenly realities that we continue to look forward to. In other words, and you'll want to remember this, understanding the religious practice and the instructions of the Old Testament is a gateway for understanding eternity. Let's look at the book of Hebrews this morning and see how it will help us. Hebrews is a letter which explains to New Testament Christians how we relate to the Old Testament. And most scholars agree that chapters 7 to 10 form the heart of the book of Hebrews. Further, they argue that chapters 8 and 9 form the heart of hearts. So if you want to know what the book of Hebrews is about, you really need to understand chapters 8 and 9. And what is flowing out of this heart of hearts is the blood of the new covenant. So being overly clever, I'm going to say we might find the aorta of this passage in Hebrews 9 and verse 15. Hebrews 9 and verse 15 reads this way: "Therefore he," that's Jesus, "is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant." Notice the context here is instruction for those who are called. It's a title for believers, that they may receive the promised eternal inheritance. To whom was an eternal inheritance promised, according to the author of Hebrews? It was promised to the people of faith, both in the Old and New Testament, but specifically to Abraham. and it was illustrated through the religious institutions of the Old Covenant given to Moses. Notice also the redemptive context. A death has occurred, as our verse says, that redeems, a redeeming death, redemption in Christ's blood. Redemption and an eternal inheritance are the twin themes of the whole of our passage of Hebrews chapters 7 to 10, and particularly of 8 and 9. We want to look a little more deeply at some details from chapters 8 and 9, but I'm going to summarize chapter 7 first. Chapter 7 takes up on chapter 6's reference to a man from the book of Genesis, whom you may know, Melchizedek. Melchi and Zedek. Melchi means king, and Zedek means righteousness. He is the king of righteousness. He was a king in Jerusalem, and he was a priest of the Most High God. Chapter 6, verses 13 to 20 tell us specifically on our theme that he is the founder of the order of Christ's redeeming priesthood in verse 20, which is the guarantee, if you see in verse 6:13, of the promised eternal inheritance. Redemption, promised eternal inheritance. That's our theme again. And just following the outline, the argument here in outline form through chapter 7, looking at this character from Abraham's life, which teaches us about our redemption and our promised eternal inheritance. It starts off in chapter 7, verses 1 to 3, by telling us what the Bible has to say about the man, Melchizedek. He is, as I said, a priest and a king of the Most High God, but he has no family. He has no ministry context. Verse 3, in fact, tells us that he resembles the Son of God. That should put off some bells in your head. Then the text proceeds in verses 4 to 10 to the giving of Abraham's tithe to Melchizedek, his offering of tithes to the Lord through Melchizedek, showing that Melchizedek was superior, spiritually speaking, a closer link to God, that is, than was Abraham and all of his descendants, including Levi, the priest, who was not yet born. And in verse 11 through 14, it picks up by showing that, therefore, Jesus' priesthood is superior. And the old priesthood in Levi is therefore no longer necessary. Which naturally includes, according to verses 15 to 19, the abolition of the Old Covenant law, which was what the Old Covenant priesthood managed. It is, in fact, according to verse 18, look at this, set aside because of its weakness and uselessness. Not mincing words. This strong and useful Melchizedekian priesthood, then, exercised by Jesus, which is better by far and makes the old obsolete because of its comparative weakness and uselessness, is confirmed by a divine oath, according to verses 20 to 22, which makes Jesus, according to verse 22, the guarantor of a better covenant, which is characterized by, and you'll note our themes again, verses 23 to 25, the eternity of the heavenly high priest and the superiority of the heavenly high priest to redeem, verses 26 to 28, eternity and redemption. What does all this strange talk about Melchizedek and the priesthood and the putting aside of the old covenant really mean? That's what chapters 8 and 9 are intended to answer for us. I always love when the Bible does this. You know, you're working on a text, you're thinking, oh, this is kind of confusing. What's going on? And then you come to a verse like chapter 8 and verse 1, and it says, now, this is the point of what we are saying. Oh, good. I want to know the point. Just get to the point. And here's the point. We have just such a high priest. One who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord has set up and not man. Listen to that. We have a high priest who now, at present, currently, today, is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty of heaven, who is a minister working the work of a priest in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord has set up and not man. The amazing contrast here is between the tabletop hockey game of the Old Covenant and the heavenly reality that we, actually enjoy. We have the real thing in its full heavenly reality. When Paul wrote to the Ephesians, he said that he has blessed us with every blessing in the heavenly places right now. We were once dead, he says, in our trespasses and sins, but having been made alive, we are now seated with Christ in the heavenly places. We are linked to heaven. That's pretty cool. But the best way then for us to understand this heavenly reality is not just to hear me say, hey, you're linked to heaven. That's cool. And you go home and say, what does that look like? The author of Hebrews knows we need something practical and meaty to grip onto. And so what better way to explain the real thing than by using the tabletop game? If I took someone to a hockey game for the first time, and they got to see all the action going on, and it seemed very confusing to them, and we came home after and they said, okay, I didn't understand what was going on when they went into there, and I could say, oh, well, here, look at my tabletop game, and let me explain to you. This is the way it works. And I would make contrasts, obviously. I would say stuff like, obviously in the real game, the defensemen aren't stuck only going up to the red line, right? They can go all the way in. And by means of contrast and illustration, I can show people what hockey looks like. And that's what the author of Hebrews wants us to do with the Old Covenant. Without getting too deeply into the literary form, this passage is another one of those wonderful chiasms that Jordan taught us about. It's shaped like an X. Things on the outside of the X, on the outside of the story, are the framework. And they work their way into the middle to the point of the X, which is the point of the story. So that's how I know what it means. All of these points are points of contrast which show us the real thing as opposed to the Old Covenant tabletop game. So let's look on the outside framework, which is going to show us what we are looking at. And we're going to do these very briefly because we're only going to focus on the main point. So let's look first at the contrast between the earthly and the heavenly sanctuary and their ministries. The earthly versus the heavenly sanctuary in their ministries. The earthly is going to be given to us in chapter 8, verses 3 to 6. For every high priest, it says, is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, speaking of Jesus, he would not be a priest at all, since there are already priests on earth who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, see that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown to you on the mountain. But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. You see in here, of course, that Moses, having been taken on the mountain, was actually shown heaven. And he was told to make a representation on earth in the tabernacle that looked like heaven. It's no coincidence that the Israelites, through all of their time, believed and understood that the temple was the place where heaven and earth met quite literally. The Ark of the Covenant that we often hear of was seen to be the footstool of God's throne. His seat was in heaven, and his feet were on earth. So good news, kids, God isn't sitting on us directly, just kicking us with his feet from time to time. When you went into the temple, and especially when you went into the Holy of Holies in the middle of it, you were actually going into, in their understanding, heaven itself. The psalmist, speaking of Mount Zion, the Temple Mount, wrote, he, God, built his sanctuary like the high heavens, and like the earth which he has founded forever. So the first section of the temple, or the tabernacle, was seen as the earth, and the Holy of Holies as heaven. In another psalm, the psalmist writes, 24:3, who shall ascend to the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in his holy place? Answering, only he who has clean hands and a pure heart. You can't get to heaven as a sinner. The original tabernacle, as I said, its construction is illustrated for us in Exodus 25 to 31. was given on the basis of the detailed instruction that God gave Moses himself, but not just instructions, on the detailed vision of what God actually showed him. Think about what that meant. Moses had the opportunity to look through the flimsy curtain that separates God's space from our space, to penetrate the veil that has been down in front of our eyes in reality since the fall in the garden. Adam and Eve were created in the image of God. They walked and talked with God. They saw reality as it truly was. After the fall, our minds were darkened so that we only see this world. And that's, by the way, why you and I continue to get bogged down in the things of this world and to see our problems as all-encompassing and to see no way out and no hope. But there is but a flimsy barrier between us and God's reality where hope perfectly exists. Well, the author of Hebrews elaborates in the paired section, who may ascend the holy hill and who may stand in the holy place. So look just ahead to the other side of that Acts in chapter 9, verses 24 to 28. Here we read, listen, Christ has entered, not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly as the high priest enters the holy place every year with blood not his own. For then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he, Jesus, has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself, and just as is appointed for all men to die once, and after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. The once and for all sacrifice of Christ reminds me of a wedding. In fact, I should rephrase that. A wedding is intended to remind us of the once for all sacrifice of Christ. That is, in fact, Paul's language in Ephesians chapter 5. And despite the fact that we have so redefined and reorganized in our society our understanding of marriage, weddings are still all the rage. And you can go to Chapters and pick up 1,000 magazines showing you all the things that you can do at your perfect wedding. And having conducted a great number of weddings now, I have talked to many brides who have told me, I want everything to be perfect. But of course they've asked me to do the wedding, so there's no guarantees. The reason why there is such an intensity around the wedding is because you only get married once, or at least that's the theory. But particularly, you don't get married to the same person again and again. I'm not sure if they love me. I'm not sure if I can better have another marriage. We'll just get married again, and then we'll be sure. Right? You guys want another wedding? It's a one-time-for-all commitment. Some events mean what they mean precisely because they are one-offs. To repeat them would be to show that you didn't understand your vows, or that somehow it hadn't worked the first time. And this is what Hebrews is insisting upon in this chapter and in the next one, when it stresses the finality of Jesus' death. It happened once for all. Verses 25 and 26, and 28, 9, 12, and 10, all say that. It was precisely something that happened once in all of history. It could not and it should not be repeated. This is central to understanding of the value and significance of Jesus' sacrifice being a better sacrifice than those which were regularly offered by the priests in the temple under the regulatory nature of the Old Covenant. And this is explained more clearly as we descend the Acts. We've now seen the outside comparison. We have the framework, the table hockey of the Old Covenant, and the heavenly reality of Christ's ministration. Now we move down deeper towards the corner, squeezing towards that goal, and we're about in the middle of the Acts. And we see a second contrast. A contrast between the first covenant, or the first promise of God, the first arrangement of God, and the new covenant, the current, the new, the fresh arrangement of God. We see the first covenant explained in chapter 8, verses 7 through 13. For, the author asks us, if the first covenant had been faultless, if it had been that perfect wedding, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. For God finds fault with them when he says, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, and so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds, and I will write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor, saying to his brother, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful towards their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more. In speaking of a new covenant, God makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. I think based on this passage that we might imagine God's redeeming work as a river. It begins as a small stream coming out of the mountain in Genesis 3:15, the proto-evangelium, the promise of a seed will deliver. And another large stream merges with it in Genesis chapter 12 in the calling of Abraham. And it flows down a great tributary in the Mosaic covenant, merging with the Davidic promises in 2 Samuel and so forth. You can piece it together. But now, at last, we are in the delta, flowing into the ocean of Christ's final work. Now imagine being on that river and riding a dinghy down the whole thing. I could just see it. Starts off pretty nice. You're on a small stream. You're going along pretty good. The ride gets a little wild. There's some rapids. There's some switchbacks. You're a little worried about how this is going, but you're making your way down. Okay, put that picture in your mind. You can imagine me in a very small dinghy rowing away. At various times during this trip, you avert hazards, you experience wonderful sights, and you may be enraptured with where you are. It's beautiful. But then you might come around a bend and decide, I'm not sure I want to go down this direction. And then you start paddling backwards. Well, I'm here to tell you, based on my broad experience, it is much better to go forward when riding a dinghy down a river. Now, the word better itself does not actually occur in the verses I just read, but it does occur more times in the book of Hebrews than in the rest of the whole New Testament combined. And in our passage, it certainly is implied. What the writer is doing is choosing passages from the Old Testament which say, in effect, look, what we have is good, but God's doing something better. What we have is true, but it isn't the whole truth. What we know at the moment is really important, but the most important thing we know is that God is planning to do something more. And the whole letter is written in order to say the something more, the whole truth, the better thing has now arrived in Jesus. So whatever you do, don't go back to the old things, however good and true they were. They are now taken up in a new and better direction. Otherwise, you'll look like me in the small dinghy rowing backwards in a river. Can't be done. You're going to go where the river is taking you, even if it's traveling down a countryside that you haven't expected. Now, Hebrews 9:15, which I call the aorta of the passage, begins to show us where the river is headed in the new covenant. Therefore, he, Jesus, is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. For where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment of the law has been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people. That's the passage I read to you from Exodus. No, I didn't read it. Saying, this is the blood of the covenant that God commanded for you. And in the same way, he sprinkled with the blood both the tent and all the vessels used in worship. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. There's our word better. All the blood of the Old Testament, and it was a bloody religion. Rip that bird's head halfway off. Sprinkle the blood on the left side, on the center, and on the right side of the altar, but not the back side of the altar, and don't twist the bird's head completely off. And all those other important instructions were given so that we would be inundated with blood. You're thinking, why? Why would this be? Because, like a table hockey game, this blood represented something. The point of sacrifice within the Old Testament system, very detailed regulations having been laid down for it, was a combination of what scholars identify as at least three things. These are three key ones. First, humans offering to God something which represents their own true selves. Humans offering to God something which represents their own true selves. The outpouring of life to signify dealing with sin. And the effects of both these in the cleansing or purifying of the worshiper. Humans offering to God something which represents their true selves. The outpouring of life to signify dealing with sin. And the effects of both these in the cleansing or purifying of the worshiper. In this passage, we go a stage further in to the heart of the second point. How the outpouring of life signifies dealing with sin. It's very mysterious. Somehow it seems the blood of the sacrificial animal was pointing forward to the deeper truth that at the heart of the sacrificial system lies the self-giving love of God himself. What this passage is basically saying, as verse 15 indicates, is that Jesus, as God's gift of love, is the one through whom there comes into being the new covenant. And particularly the one through whom the new covenant promises that sin will finally be forgiven in a way they hadn't been under the previous covenant. But our writer here introduces a shockingly new idea. This covenant, he explains, can only come into force on the death of the person who made it. Why is that so shocking? Since a death has occurred. Well, this works for the author of Hebrews, who wrote to people who spoke Greek, by a clever play on words that you will probably want to know, so that you can use this clever play on words later on your spouse or children who give you the message. The word covenant, kind of like an agreement or a contract or a treaty, is the same word in Greek also used for a will, as in a last will and testament. And for the argument of verses 18 to 22 to work, it must be taken to mean specifically this, that the blood of the sacrificial animals, which through the first covenant made through Moses came to being, was a representation of the self-giving love of God. Okay? So the illustration here is of a last will and testament, where God actually gives something of himself through his death. And we're told that the Old Covenant sacrifices were a picture of God giving something to us from himself through his death in our Lord Jesus Christ. So that we're not heretics. God the Son died, not God the Father. But since the Trinity is all interrelated, we may speak freely of the fact that God gave of himself, while still recognizing that it was the second person of the Trinity. There. You're safe. Okay. In other words, let me try to clarify. Our passage says that everything to do with the first covenant, the book itself in which it was written, the people with whom it was made, the tabernacle where the sacrifices would thereafter take place, and the vessels of the various sorts that were used in regular worship, everything had to be sprinkled in blood. And all of this blood, all of it, was saying and pointing in every possible aspect of worship. All this happens because I, God, love you enough to give my own self, my own life for you. The animals were not just representing the people who came to worship. They actually stand as the gift from God who created them to his people. with their death, symbolized by the pouring out of their lifeblood. There was a sign of God's own self-sacrificial love. And this is what we should see now as we begin to peer into Old Covenant worship. If you study the Old Testament and you say, what is the deal with this thing with the dove? This is God showing that he loves every element in your worship. Now, we'll get to the heart. The center of the X. The point at which we are going. We have moved from this illustration of table hockey in heaven to a contrast between the covenants and how they focus on God's love, to the central meaning now, which will guide us in our study of the Old Testament, and it is this. There were two arrangements, worship under the old arrangement and worship under the new arrangement, both pointing to the same thing, but accompanied by different things. That's my hint. I've been droning too long. Let's move through. When Garth does it, then I get worried. Hebrews chapter 9, verses 1 to 10 explains worship under the old arrangement. Now, even the first covenant had regulations for worship and on earthly places of holiness. For a tent was prepared. The first section, in which there was a lampstand and the table and the bread of the presence, it's called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a second section called the most holy place, having the golden altar of incense and the ark of the covenant covered on all sides with gold, in which there was a golden urn holding the manna, and Aaron's staff that budded, and the tablets of the covenant above it, were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Well, of these things we can't now speak in detail. These preparations having thus been made, the priests go regularly into the first section, regularly into the holy place, performing their ritual duties. But into the second, the most holy place, only the high priest goes, and he but once a year, and not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the unintentional sins of the people. By this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the holy places is not yet opened as long as the first section is still standing, which is symbolic for the present age. According to this arrangement, the gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but deal only with the foods and drinks and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until the time of Reformation. He specifically says that that picture of the tabernacle is symbolic for the present age. The movement of the high priest from the regular holy place into the Holy of Holies is symbolic of the present age. It is to be to us a table hockey game that we are now looking at and being told this is symbolic of the real thing. When you arrive in the grand metropolis of Edmonton, you will see that hell really can freeze over. But if you go in the summer, you will see that there are signs warning travelers that there will be construction. And unfortunately, Carmen's not here, but you can ask her after. She will testify that when I drive into town, I read the signs in only a half-mocking way as saying this: welcome to Edmonton. There will be construction on streets and avenues. Expect delays. There are really only two seasons in Edmonton: freeze and construction. The good thing about freeze is that the mosquitoes die. The good thing about construction is that you can feel your toes. When people in Edmonton do a major construction project, they make it last a decade. In Calgary, we get a new overpass in a matter of months. In Edmonton, you may die before you see that road. And so Edmonton constantly has to reroute you through all of these different roads. And you get stuck in traffic, and you're rerouted on this little temporary pavement. And this is how it was when they were doing their new ring road about the time that I was leaving Edmonton. And the thing is that when you have this construction during the entire period, decades if you're in Edmonton, alternate arrangements have to be made to enable the traffic to get through as well as it can, all through the building process. Life has to go on, people have to get to work, I have to be able to get out of Edmonton. And if, like me, you lived in Edmonton during the construction years and then moved on, and possibly, blessedly, never had to go back, then you might never see the results, just the temporary arrangements. You might never know the master plan. You might just grumble about the traffic. You might just see the chaos. Verse 10 is trying to tell us that all that happened in Old Testament worship was, and I love the word, imposed upon the people until the time of Reformation. God has all along had a master plan for how he would set everything right in the world. He has envisioned from the beginning the way in which the wickedness and frailty of his people would be taken care of. How sin would be dealt with. And the entire world would be reformed. But for all sorts of reasons, they could not all be done at once. And temporary arrangements, just like Edmonton traffic, had to be made to keep things flowing and to regulate ongoing human life until the appointed time. Now, verse 9, you will find very helpful in your study of the Old Testament. It tells us that all these things are symbolic for our age. We can learn from them. The Greek word that ESV translates as symbol, if you have an NIV, you will see it translates it as illustration, is the Greek word parabole or parable. Like the stories Jesus told. What this verse means is that each of the gifts, offerings, and sacrifices of the Old Testament were elements that served as a model or an example pointing beyond itself to a later realization, according to one theologian. This is what scholars call typology. There is a type and an antitype. A tabletop hockey table and the real thing. There is a symbol and the thing it points to. Now the Holy Spirit, Hebrews 9:9 reveals, is telling us that as long as these symbols still stand, the way into the holy places is not open. You need to go to a priest who will go ahead of you and will offer the sacrifices which grant you a measure of access, however temporary, around all those construction roads. But in our next section, we see that construction season is coming to a close. 9:11-14 speaks of worship under the new arrangement, the glorious blessings that we today enjoy, because when Jesus died, the veil of the temple was ripped from the roof to the ground. The earth shook, and a new way was opened. Verse 11 says, but when Christ, when the Messiah appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus, theme piece, securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of an heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God. Carmen and I moved to Korea in 2005, and it was a bit of a whirlwind. We weren't planning any kind of move just a few weeks earlier, and then all of a sudden we were going to the other side of the world. How many of you have taken one of those lovely 20-hour intercontinental flights? Aren't they fun? The way back, we got upgraded to first class. I was so happy. But there was a little boy also in first class, and just as I fell asleep, he came and climbed in my lap and joke me. His parents apparently thought it was funny or something. Well, anyway, back to my first story. We finally arrived in Korea in what was the middle of the night there, in the middle of the day back at home. We'd really lost more than a night of sleep being in coach. And we were greeted at the airport by a guy with a sign displaying our names, who then took us on a 2-hour drive through a city that looked so foreign it was like being awake in some kind of anime-endorsed dream. The signs were unreadable, the architecture was alien, and then finally we left the big city. And we were all turned around by the time we arrived at what our driver called a country-style town of just 1 million souls. Small towns in Korea are a little different than here. The muggy heat was absolutely out of this world. You can't even begin to imagine it in the middle of the night. We're already travel sicky after 20 hours on airplanes and 2 hours in a car. But now we were super sweaty by the time we got to the skyscraper that was to be our home. And up we went in our little country town to the 17th floor of our apartment building. And then we walked down a dank, slightly aromatic hallway with pipes visible outside the walls and flickering lights, which was open to the outside heat. And a key was produced by our driver who opened the door for us to allow us to go in. And we came in to behold all the glory of our 400 square foot apartment for the first time. It had red and pink sheets on the windows. It had dark floors and dark walls. The ceiling and roof were stained with what we later determined was mold. And the undersized air conditioner was never able to bring it below 27 degrees during the half a year that was summer. And I can tell you that 27 felt blessedly cool on some of those days. Straight ahead was a lovely pink couch in freshman college condition, and a bed that we were wondering if we really ought to lie down on. To our left was a small fridge, we might call it a bar fridge, and a countertop heating element. To our immediate left, and this was to the glory of the whole thing, was the shower, laundry, toilet, combo closet. That is right, you can do your business, take a shower, and get your socks to laundry all at the same time. The door closed and the man walked away, and Carmen began to cry. And I thought to myself, what have I done? And then I blamed my friend who told me it was a good idea. A few months later, things began to look up. We moved into a new apartment building, into a new apartment for us. It was bright. It was clean. The air conditioning worked. The roof had a garden with shade, benches, and flowers. It was closer to where we were working. Everything was better. The move was worth it in every single way. I think that's a good picture of what 9 verses 11 to 14 is trying to point us to. The point of all the contrasts that we have read was to get the original readers of the book of Hebrews to see this kind of apartment change in every aspect of their identity as Christians. And just as much as it was true for the Hebrews, it's also true for us who come from a non-Christian background, any kind of pagan background, or a false Christianity facade background. The real thing is a breath of fresh air. It's better for 3 reasons. First, in terms of the tabernacle which Christ entered. Verse 11 says, when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, but is not of this creation, we are immediately to see our high priest is in heaven. There is no more bloody religion. Our high priest is in heaven. It is glorious. It is incredible. It is secure. Chapter 6, we learn that he has gone behind the veil as an anchor sure and steadfast, holding our souls into heaven, so that nothing in this world can ever befall us that could possibly harm us. Jesus says you fear those who can kill the body and after that can do no more. And you think that makes sense. Yeah, I fear those guys. He says, how about this? How about the one that controls both body and soul? Our high priest is in heaven, and we are linked to him, and we are secure for all eternity. We may perhaps think it very difficult to think of this heavenly sanctuary as an actual building, and of course that's the point. The building on earth and the building in heaven are quite different. This was not made with human hands. This is not table hockey. Table hockey is just a signpost to reality. You will not go to the Olympics and watch the gold medal game and say, oh my, table hockey's amazing. The reality is that God dwells in light and holiness, which would dazzle us completely. And we can only come near to him if someone like the high priest in the temple goes ahead of us to present tokens of our purification, to certify that we have been past fit to enter. And Jesus has done that for us, for all eternity. The second way in which the new covenant is better than the old is this: that the Messiah has presented before God not the blood of regular animal sacrifices, but his own blood, verse 12. He entered once for all into the holy place, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. Our theme again, eternal redemption. his own blood. This is perhaps the most striking or shocking thing in the whole letter. It's not shocking to us because we're Christians and we say, yeah, Jesus died for my sins. I taught my 3-year-old that. I learned that when I was 3. Everybody knows Jesus died for sins. But at almost no point in the voluminous Jewish literature, the Bible, and outside of the Bible, even to contemporary times, was there ever any suggestion that human sacrifice might be a good thing. It's always and everywhere condemned. Still less, was there ever the idea that Messiah himself would become a formal sacrifice? We certainly have wonderful passages, like Isaiah 53, which show that the Messiah would die on behalf of the people. We get that. Jews got that. But there was no suggestion that the high priest of the Old Testament, symbolically or really, would be sacrificing himself. Imagine that. Okay, guys, I'm going into the holy place. Is ready? And you go, what? What does that mean? That's crazy. And yet that's what Jesus did for us. The writer is leading us closer and closer to the heart of the deep mystery that sacrifice involves. Remember earlier I said it had 3 elements? There was a sense of a human offering to God something valuable and pure as a sign of their grateful offering of their whole lives to Him for His service. Second, there is a sense of the life of the sacrificial animal, symbolized by the blood being poured out in death as a sign that though our lives are indeed forfeit because of our wickedness and impurity, God will rescue us by providing a life given in death instead of ours. And third, there is a sense that though through these two signs, our present state of uncleanness can be washed away. That is, that we give ourselves and that death has occurred. Through these two things, our sin and uncleanness can be washed away. We can start fresh, cleansed and fit for God's service. It's hard to say how much of this was fully understood in the minds of those Old Testament worshipers. Because while Jesus was the high priest, equated with the high priest, Jesus also was the lamb that was slain. But symbolism often communicates to people even better than their conscious minds realize. And if year after year after year after year you offered these sacrifices and it just got in your mind, and then someone came and told you the shedding of blood is necessary for the forgiveness of sins, you'd say, what's this? And if you said, the shedding of an ultimate sacrifice will ultimately take care of sins, you'd say, that makes sense. And you would say, God loved you so much that He sent His own Son, who shed His blood for you. You would say, oh. When you take these 3 elements as something like the meaning of the ancient Israelite sacrifice, you begin to see the ways in which the Lord's death could take their place in a better, final, and once for all way. Jesus is the representative human being. He's the covenant head, just as Adam was the first head. In Adam all die, so in Christ all are made alive. All became sinners in Adam, in Christ all are made righteous. In chapter 2 of Hebrews, relating to Psalm chapter 8, whatever it is. What is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visit him? Find that passage. Jesus is identified as a representative man. And the offering of His own life to God, therefore, is the laying down obediently in death of the whole of humanity. Or at least redeemed humanity. His life given in death functions on our behalf. He died, and therefore we need to do so. And when we are baptized with Him, Romans 5 says, we are baptized into His death. Where the ancient animal sacrifice functioned as a way of purifying the outward life of the worshiper, who might have become unclean through physical pollution or the effects of their own sin, the self-offering of Jesus goes deeper. And as the true high priest, His cleansing cleanses all, which brings me to the third and final way in which our passage shows the sacrifice is better. It reaches to the very depths of the human person. It is radical. And this is why we have. It is better in every way. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer, sanctified for the purification of the flesh, covers things up, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered Himself without blemish to God, purify our consciences from dead works to serve the living God? You might feel hopeless today. You might feel that you are trapped in sin. Jesus said, whoever commits sin is a slave to that sin which he commits. You might feel that you cannot please God in whatever relationship you're in. You might feel that you cannot please God in your place of employment. You might feel that you have a breakdown that is so catastrophic that there is no way that you can fix it. It cannot be covered up. And you're probably right. What we are learning in this passage is that something greater than you, something unimaginably greater than you, is what can fix it. It is the eternal Spirit that comes into your most innermost being and changes you, changes your inclinations, changes your desires, changes your heart of hearts, and begins to pump through you a new spiritual vitality. Just as Jesus went into the very presence of God, not simply a man-made building with an inner chamber, but in the presence of God, who is light and holiness. So the effects of his sacrifice, which ties us to that place, doesn't just deal with our outer lives, but goes into us and restores our fellowship by making us clean in our inner depths. The Holy of Holies at the core of each individual person. The place where we really are who we are. And Hebrews will speak several more times of the conscience of worshipers, 9:14, 10:2, 10:22, 13:18, and each time the writer is stressing the fact that under the new covenant there is a purification available that goes to the very center of things. You can change. In particular, this purification washes us clean from dead works. Useless works, failing works, trying again and again but not cutting it, so that we can serve the living God, verse 14. The book of Hebrews has made very clear that dead works apply both to pagan backgrounds and Jewish backgrounds now. For anyone who would turn in repentance on becoming a Christian, and God will deal. The living God, the God whom Israel had always worshipped, but whose saving plan was still in the preliminary stage, who sent them around alternative paths of traffic, had revealed once and for all in Jesus the way into his presence, the way in consequence by which we can serve him gladly and joyfully without the slightest shadow or stain on our conscience. The lesson of the table hockey of the Old Testament covenant, when we understand it in light of the new, is that we are floating down the final approach of the river to the ocean of a restored heaven and earth. Many of us are still clinging to the banks, paddling backwards, holding back, living in sins, living in temporary pleasures, trying to hold on to the old patterns of pagan worship, pre-Christian thinking, or old Jewish sacrifices. And this is ruining our joy. This is ruining the blessedness we can have. This is veiling our faces even further. This is leaving us in Edmonton. We are called to an exuberant and joyful service, free from any motivation caused by guilt and fear, away from dead works to serve the living God. Why do you think such a liberating and healing message is so hard to believe and remember? The message of the Old Covenant is have faith in God. He has a plan. The message of the New Covenant is have faith in God. Here is his plan. Let the rivers of redemption flow through you this morning. And realize the redemption that is found in Christ and the eternal promise that is made to you if you will trust and believe in him. Heavenly Father, let us not hold back this morning. Let us not cling to the banks of our foolish sins and futile ideas that flow with the river of grace. Let us move into the ocean of your love and of your glory and of your beauty. And let not one person leave this room today without knowing the power of your Holy Spirit beginning even now to effect this change.